Awesome, everyone. Well, welcome to everybody that is their first time joining us and everyone returning. Welcome back. I'm Amber. I'm joined by Grant, Laura, Daniel, and Kevin. They'll be helping guiding me and you through the session today. Welcome to Trey Labs. So what is Trey Labs? Trey Labs is an enablement session that we provide for customers. It's tailored specifically for people that have access to Trey so that you can work along with us. And we hold these sessions weekly, every Friday at 3 p.m. We're looking to expand this to additional times to allow other people to be able to attend these sessions as well. Anyone can attend, but to participate, you would need a Trey account. And all of the resources will be sent out in an email post-session. So that includes the slides, the document walking you through the workflow, and then the recording from this session. So in addition to Trey Labs, we also have Trey Academy. If you haven't had a chance to go through Trey Academy yet, I highly recommend it. Having this fundamental understanding of how the platform works is really going to help you absorb all the information that we cover in each of these sessions. So all of our sessions are broken down into 3 parts. We build together, we test each section, and then after each section of the workflow, we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you get stuck along the way, feel free to raise your hand. Over in the chat, there's an option for you to raise your hand. And one of the TAs, perfect, yep. So one of the TAs will come in and direct message you and help get you unstuck. If you feel like you need to ask a question, feel free to speak up as well. We also encourage you guys to use your reactions if you're following along, thumbs ups. If you want me to slow down, use the slow down. We're looking out for those as well. So if you're new to Trey, we're going to be going through how to use the builder each time. So that way the material really sticks with you, because we'll be covering over like terminology, how to navigate through the workflow builder itself. So if it is your first time, no worry, you'll be able to follow along just as much as everybody else. So the use case today, we're going to be looking at how to process large data sets in a scalable way with the Stripe connector. So we're going to be covering the concept of paginating, batching, and then we're going to discuss limitations with doing this. So our workflow is going to be broken down into 5 sections. The first is going to be authenticating. Then we're going to go and fetch data. We're going to look at paginating the data, and then we're going to optimize our workflow. And if time permits, we're going to look at how to batch that data. So if everybody could navigate to their Trey dashboard. And from your Trey dashboard, either in your personal workspace, in your organization, that can be found up in the top left corner. I'm going to be working out of my personal, but if you would like to share these workflows with everyone on your team, you can drop down and click organization. So from within here, I'm going to be creating a new workflow. To do so, I'm going to click new workflow. Now I need to give a name to my workflow. So the naming convention that we're going to be using to denote that this is a Trey Lab session, I'm going to say Trey Labs. And today we're going to be covering paginating data, paginating and batching, and we're going to be using the Stripe connector. And I'll probably put with Stripe. Once again, you can change who has access to your workflow here, and if you choose to share this with your team later on, you can always update this after we complete the workflow. So go ahead and click next. This is going to prompt the trigger selection. So most of our workflows that we'll be working on within Trey Labs will be utilizing the manual trigger, but there are a ton of different triggers that you can select from, some of them being pre-configured webhooks, or we have the Trey options for alerting workflows, which we covered last week. And this week, we're going to also be looking at callable triggers. Scheduled triggers allow you to select a workflow to run on a certain interval or cadence. And then the non-configured webhook that allows you to connect to any service that has webhooks available that you do not find here in this list. So go ahead and select the manual trigger and click Create Workflow. This is going to load your workflow builder. So in the center, you have your workflow canvas. To the left is your connectors panel, and to the right is your connectors pane. When you select any particular connector, your connectors pane will be populated with all of the configurations and properties for that particular connector. So our first section is to authenticate. So we're going to look at authenticating a Stripe connector. So everybody search for Stripe in your connector panel, click, drag straight underneath your trigger. So it's always good practice to go ahead and take care of your authentication before diving into building, just so that you know that you don't have any blockers that have to do with authenticating or permissions within any service that you're trying to use. That way, when you're building, you can have that already taken care of and you're not having to go back or stop because you don't have the proper permission. So once you have the Stripe connector added to the page, we're going to look at authenticating. So you're going to click on New Authentication. You're going to name your authentication. So the nomenclature we use here is in square brackets, I like to put what environment I'm using. This is going to be a test environment. So this is a test environment. This is a Trey Labs Stripe account. And then I like to put the date. So today is the 5th, 2020. And you can also share this like we did with our workflow. You can keep it personal or organization. If you have a workflow that is shared organization level, you cannot use personal level authentication. It must match, but you can have a personal workflow with organization level authentication. I'm going to keep this personal. Next, what I'm going to do is click Next Step, which is going to prompt me to look for an API key. So I'm going to put a link in the chat, and there's going to be a generated API key for you within the documentation for Stripe. Chat is in the window. So in the chat, let me know if anybody isn't able to find that. So from the documentation, when you get the link, on the right-hand side, there's going to be some example here where there's a get call. And there's a line on number 2 that says -u. Copy the value that is sk_test, and then whatever value is generated. So each of you should have a unique value generated. I'm going to copy that value, come back to my workflow, paste that in my API key area, and then press Create Authentication. Was everybody able to add their authentication to their workflow? And feel free to use the thumbs up emotion. Awesome. So now what we want to do is change our operation. So we need to test that our authentication is working, right? Sometimes when we copy stuff, we can copy like a hidden character or a white space, which can cause some authentication issues. So what we want to do is just make sure that everything is working as expected. So I'm going to click on List Invoices from my operation. And once I have that selected, I'm going to navigate down to the bottom right, and I'm going to run my workflow. Once I click Run Workflow, I can navigate to my debug logs. Up in the top center, we can change the view from Build to Debug, which will change our connector panel out to the debug logs. But it looks like my connector failed on authentication. So invalid API key. I think because I already have one here. But everybody else should have their API keys. Everybody's working. Does anybody else have any issue? Get a special character copied?
Mine failed too, I think. So
make sure that you don't copy.
I think the colon may have been copied.
You don't want to copy that colon.
Yeah.
So I updated my authentication. And if you had an issue where you copied the colon, I would just create a new authentication, and then we can go in and delete the other one. I can show you after we work through the workflow. So clicking on the stripe step, if everything worked correctly, I can see that my input shows my masked API key. I can see the limit that was set in, and then I can see all the data that came back. Was everybody able to make a successful call to Stripe to get a list of invoices? Very good. So we added the Stripe connector, we authenticated the connector, we set the operation to list invoices, we verified the Stripe authentication. So all of our steps for section 1 are now complete. Now it's time to fetch the data. So we're going to update the Stripe step title. We're going to add a loop collection connector, and we're going to add another Stripe connector to our workflow. So back in our workflow, let's look for the loop connector. So it's loop collection. Grab that, drag that underneath your Stripe step. And then we're going to go back to our connectors panel, and we're going to look for the Stripe step again. Find it, hold it, drag it and drop it. We now should have 3 separate connectors on our page. So going back to the first Stripe step, we're going to just rename this step. So the renaming of this step, we want to name it something meaningful, so when other people that are working on this workflow or just viewing don't have to go into every step to see what is happening in the workflow. So let's name something meaningful, maybe just get invoices or get list invoices or just list invoices. Right, that way there's a quick overview of what this step is actually doing. Next we want to do is click onto our loop connection. This is going to populate all of the properties for the loop connector. So what we want to do is we want to go through the list that we saw in our output. We want to go through each one of those records, and we want to do some action to that record using another Stripe connector. So to access the value from a previous step, we can use the connector snake to dynamically set a value. So this is saying this value takes a list. You can either hard code in values or grab the dot directly next to the list title, drag it up to your Stripe connector, drop it, and then select the data you're looking for. We're looking for the high level data, the entire array that comes back. You can see now that the value is set to the Stripe data. Last thing to do for this step is to update the title to something meaningful. What is this doing? Well, it's doing something to each invoice. So I'm going to rename this for each invoice. So for each invoice, I'm going to cycle through. So it's going to go one by one, each invoice, keep looping. So if there's 100 invoices, we're going to have 100 loops plus one. We always have one more loop than we do items in a list because our loop must cycle again to check to make sure that there are no more items in your list, but it's not going to carry out any of the steps in the work or in the loop itself. It'll continue on in your workflow. Next, we're going to click on into our Stripe connector. So this is Stripe number 2. And what we're going to be doing here is getting the customer. So we're going to get customer. And we need to be able to fetch a customer by its ID. Every invoice has a customer attached to it. Every invoice is being looped over so that every invoice we can grab the customer. In order to dynamically set the value for the ID here, we're going to use the connector snake, drag that up to our loop, and release. This should populate a drop-down with all of the values from your output. This isn't always the case. A lot of the times, Trey is going to make the assumption of what is the expected output for each step when you're using the connector snake. If you're not seeing the data populated like I am, what you can do is go back to your debug logs from your previous run. If you have the loop step there, in this case we don't, but in each step in the output, you can say use output. So the use output, what that's going to do is enable you to have the populated drop down here. So if you're not seeing that populated list, what you can do is look for a terminate step, grab the terminate step, add it right before your Stripe step, let that save, press run workflow, navigate to your debug logs, look at the next step. That's calling on my Stripe. Takes about 3 seconds, 4 seconds to respond. We now have the single invoice in the loop. So now I can click on use output. So I know without a doubt that drop down that I'm seeing is showing the proper values that I need for setting my invoice or my customer ID. So I can come back to build right here, remove my terminate, click into my Stripe step, go back to my customer ID, grab the connector snake, and now what I'm looking for is the customer. So now I have the customer. What this is going to do is go through each one and find each customer. So I'm going to update the title to get customer. We can run this. It might take a little while to complete this particular execution because there are 100 records, but let's go ahead and let it run just to take a look at what our output should be. So click run, move back to your debug logs. Over here in your debug logs, we can see that we have different indicators of colors. So we have red, which means failure, green, which means success, gray, which means stopped or terminated, and yellow means the execution is still running. Each execution is date time stamped, so you can see which is the most recent. Click into that, and now we can see all of our steps are running. For every invoice, we're gonna go fetch the customer. So if I click into one of these, I can see that I'm getting data back about that particular customer. This would be useful if you're trying to populate a CRM or maybe passing in all of your invoice information into QuickBooks or NetSuite. We've left that kind of open-ended. This is more so to show you the concept of how to grab the data. So back in our steps, we've completed steps 1 and 2. The next step is to look at paginating data. So what we're going to do here, question. Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we move on real quick, just make sure we went over the fact that since we had already set an authentication for an earlier Stripe connector, the second one that we dropped in already has an authentication pre-built into it. So when you're working with service connectors, multiple instances of a service connector in a workflow, your authentication is already set when you add a new one.
Great point. Yep. So to reiterate, any connector that requires authentication, if you clone it or if you go find another connector that's the same type, it's going to automatically populate the authentication that was selected for the first service. So if you're needing to use a different API token for maybe going to get your customers for some reason, or maybe for another, you're hitting some other database, it requires different authentication, be sure to make sure to select the proper authentication from your dropdown. Does anybody have any questions before we move on?
Wait, I have a quick one. I got a little bit behind. Which ID from the invoice is the customer ID?
Yep. So what we looked at was getting the ID from the loop. So for each invoice, the invoices are going to be passed into the loop step. So our list is going to be the output from Stripe 1. So all of our invoices are now accessible from our loop. So from our customer, for a customer, the ID is going to be populated from the loop value. So for each iteration of the loop, this will change depending on which invoice we are according to the loop.
Okay.
So the value is customer.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Now we're going to be looking at paginating the data. So we looked at just grabbing a single request, right? But we can't always make the assumption that one request is going to grab all the data. Most APIs are going to have a limitation on how much data can be pulled in at once. So in this case, Stripe has a limitation of 100 records per request. So we need to set up a process to continue to fetch more data until all data has been brought into the workflow. To do so, we're going to add another loop collection. We're going to use a data storage connector, a Buoyant condition, a break loop. We're then going to move our steps that we've already created into our new loop step. We'll add a list helper, and finally, another data storage step. That's a lot of steps, but we're going to move together. And if you have any questions, remember to use the raise hand option. So back in our workflow, we're going to search for the loop collection. I'm going to drag the loop collection right above my steps. This will be loop 2. My operation is going to be loop forever. I don't know how many records I have in Stripe. I just want to keep fetching them until they're all collected. So I'm going to loop forever until I tell the loop when to stop. We're going to rename this. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing that we want to add is a data storage step. So over in the connectors panel, I'm looking for data storage. I'm going to grab the data storage and add it directly inside of my loop step. So this is going to be used to keep track of where we are. So if I just keep making requests, I need some way to say, hey, I've already collected this data. Now move on to the next. Most APIs either have some key that they give you or some way of paginating. This particular API, looking at their documentation, any connector used will have documentation either on Trey, and if you're looking for additional context, you can go to their documentation. And we can see here in the parameters that are allowed to be passed in, which also match the parameters over here on the connector, that there is a start after option. The start after option allows us to set a value where we will start after when we start paginating through data as we collect our 100 records. So this is the key I'm going to be using, called start after. So I'm going to update my record or my data storage operation to get value. I'm not setting it yet. This is where I'm going to be getting it. And this is going to be my, like I said, starting after. So that's my key. And I have a default value. So the default value, as in the very first time we go and fetch data, we obviously do not have a starting after because we haven't fetched anything yet. So we're going to leave our default value as a string, an empty string. So there's just nothing there. And this is going to be our Stripe cursor. So this is what is going to tell us where we are at in our data set of collecting. Next, what we want to do is pull our Stripe 2 connector into our loop 2 connector directly underneath the storage step. Once you have your Stripe connector, you're going to update your starting after. So your starting after value, which is down towards the very bottom of the properties, is going to be coming out of our storage 1 value. So you can see here, I have starting after, storage 1, my output's coming out of here. So I'm not setting the value, I'm getting the value. Anytime you set a value, you would have to use a get because you can't do both in one step, but you can set a default value. So like I said, the first time around, it's going to be empty. So the first time I'm just going to grab the first 100. The second time around, I'm obviously going to set it somewhere, but the second time around we'll have a value set here for the connector to read from. So once you have the starting after dynamically set using the connector snake up to storage 1, go ahead and grab your loop 1, which includes the Stripe 2, and drag that directly under the Stripe 1 connector. So everything should be inside of loop 2 at this point.
Real quick, I think I missed the setting the default value to the string value. Could you just return it very quickly?
Definitely. So over in the connector, so if you click into storage 1, your operation is set to get value, key is starting after. Every single input is going to have a drop down for a data type. For the default value, I set it from being null to string, and then it's just leaving it as empty string.
All right, thanks.
And one thing to note on here, you can always tell what data type, as in like what value type it is. It's going to have it here. So this little A is text. If it's a JSON path, it's going to have the little path here. If it's a number, it's going to show a number. And if it's a object, it'll look like a little piece of paper. If it is a array or a list, it's going to be square brackets. So it's a little helpful tip when looking at like outputs or some of these values over in your connectors pane. It's just a little indicator. So back in our workflow canvas, we've added 2 steps and updated 1, 2, 3, right? So we've moved 3 steps into our loop and then just made an alteration to the Stripe step. Now what we need to do is add our list helper.
And sorry to slow you down. When I draw my snake in list Stripe invoices from starting after to Stripe cursor, I don't get that.
Yep, you want to make sure your operation is set to get value.
Yep.
So if it's set to get value, have a default value, it should then show you the value. Make sense? Cool. So we need to add a Buoyant condition, a list helper, a break loop step, and another storage connector. So I have my list helper. I also need to add a Buoyant. I need to add a break loop. So I'm going to come over and look for break loop. I'm going to put that in my false branch. We'll talk about why soon. And then finally, I'm going to add one more data storage connector. So these are all the steps that I need to achieve the paginating over all of the data to pull it into my workflow. Every service that requires you to batch the data or paginate the data is going to be different. It's going to have the same concept of cycling through, setting some key, or checking if a data is still coming back from it. But in this particular case, we know that it's going to need a after key from looking at the documentation. Not all documentation is friendly. Stripe happens to be very readable and easy to look through. But we also have documentation within Trey for each of these connectors as well. But if you're not finding what you're looking for, you can always go to Google to find that service's API documentation. Great. So now we need to configure our Buoyant condition. The Buoyant condition is going to tell us, this is going to be our question, if we need to stop paginating or keep continuing fetching data, right? We're using an endless loop. If you have an endless loop, you need a way to get out of that loop. This is where that's going to happen. We're going to check if data is still coming back from from Stripe. So what we're going to do is inside of our Buoyant condition, our first value, we're going to take it and grab it up to Stripe 1. Stripe 1 is going to be data. So we're looking at our data. In this evaluation, we're evaluating our data to see if there's actually data there. So I'm going to say if my data is not equal to an empty array. So if it's not equal to an empty array, and I did that by selecting array from my data type dropdown here. So if it's not equal to an empty array, that means there's more data to go. There's more data coming in. There's more data for me to fetch. So I need to keep paginating over this connector, doing this cycle to continue grabbing the data. So like I said, your first value, which is going to be what you're going to be looking at, is the data returned from Stripe. You're making an evaluation. So you're comparing it and you're saying this is not equal to empty array, because if it was an empty array, there's no data, there's nothing, there's not going to be an after cursor returned by Stripe. So if that's the case, what's going to happen is this evaluation is going to come down either a false branch, but if it is not equal to, it's going to continue down a true branch. So if it's down the true branch, we're going to continue on in our process. And if it goes down the false branch, we want to stop our process because there's no more data to grab. So let's rename our title and say data returned. I always name my Buoyant conditions with a question because it's making an evaluation, and it helps me when I'm looking at my workflow see that there's some kind of decision making here, right? You're either going to keep going or you're going to stop, or maybe you're going to make some other decision on what to do within the false branch. In the false branch, we added the break loop. What the break loop does is it's either going to allow you to continue on in the process, like maybe skip some steps, or stop the process completely and continue on with the workflow. we want to break the process completely. We do not want to continue looping. So we're going to leave the operation at break. Next, we need to select which loop we want to break. This will show you which loops you have available. We're going to select loop 2. So we're going to break out of this outer paginating loop if there's no more data returned. So I'm going to update my title, and that's all I need to do for this step. But if it's true, there is data, we're going to continue down the true branch. You'll notice I didn't actually put my steps in my true branch, I put it underneath. The reason being is that everything's continuing on down this straight path, right? This data isn't going to come here. If this data made like a pit stop, made some alterations, and then continued on, I would want to put these steps maybe in my true branch because I don't want these steps to be affected by anything from the true branch. But it doesn't matter. Nothing from the true branch is going to continue on in this part of the workflow. So I add it underneath my Buoyant step. What we're going to do here is grab our after record. So what that looks like is what Stripe sends back to us is they're going to send back a list of records. So each record is going to look something like this. And in order to grab the next batch, what they say to do is use the ID of the record, the very last record returned to you. So if I have 100 records, I'm going to grab the last one in the list. I'm going to use its ID to say, starting at this point, go grab more records. So in order to grab the very last record without having to like go through the looping process, we can use the list helper. The operation that we're going to use is last, which should be the default value. This is going to pluck out the very last object from a list. The list I'm going to be pulling from is my Stripe list, right? All the data that's coming back from Stripe. So I'm going to, once again, use my connector snake up to my Stripe 1 step. From the dropdown, I'm going to select data. So my JSON path will look like $, steps, and then the step name, and then the key I'm looking for, which is data. So I'm grabbing the last element from my list. So I'm going to say fetch last invoice. So that's what this step is doing. So once I have my last invoice, I want to grab the ID or set the ID on my key. So back up in storage 1, I'm getting my key. Down here in storage 2 is where I'm going to set my key. So I'm going to change my operation to set value. And here's where I'll put that key. I'm going to use the same exact key that I used in step 1, which is starting after. Paste that in my key. My value is going to come out of my list helpers 1. I'm going to grab my connector snake, go to list helpers 1, grab result. You notice it didn't give me the value that I was expecting to get back, right? I need the actual ID. I can either go to my debug logs and look at what the key is that I'm looking for, or I can put a terminate step, run it again, and use the output like I showed at the beginning of the session. Here I'm going to show you how to do it just by visually looking at the JSON so you know both ways on how to collect this information. So I know that it's coming from the result of this step, but what is the key that I'm looking for? So to look at what the key is, I can go to my debug logs and look at an invoice. So I'm going to click on any of these loop steps to look at any given invoice. I can expand the output to see a much bigger view of it. And I can see, what am I looking for? I'm looking for the ID of this object. So what I want is the ID value. So it's going to be the ID key that I'm looking for. So all I need to do is go back to my build, come down to my data storage step where I have my JSON path, and I'm going to add .id. Finally, what I'm going to do is just rename my step. This is going to be set stripe cursor. So what will happen here is we're going to continue to go check to see if there's a cursor. If there's a cursor, we're going to pass it into Stripe. Stripe's going to go get the data after that starting point. We're going to loop through each invoice and get each customer. Check if data is being returned. If data was returned, we're going to fetch the last item in the list of invoices. Then from that list of invoices, we're going to grab the ID of it. That ID is going to be used for the next cycle around on to the next group of records that we pull from Stripe. We can start to run this, but there are hundreds of thousands of records. So this will take a very long time to run. So we'll just run it and then we'll stop it, and I'll show you how to stop it. So we can click run, move to your debug logs. We can see this happening. So it's going to go through and get each customer, and you can see where you are in your cycle of customers. And you can see you're at the 14th customer. So this might take a little bit of time. So while this is running, what we can do is talk about what's going on here a little bit more. So for every 100 records, we're going to go grab every record customer. Then after each of those steps are completed, we're going to check if we need to keep batching or paginating, and we're going to do the same thing. So each one of these steps takes anywhere from 3 to 4 seconds to complete. And then each one of these, there's some time consumption as well. This process could take a long time depending on how much data you're actually pulling in. So what we can do to speed this process up and make it scalable is we can parallelize our workflow to take some of this process out of this workflow and put it in another workflow so that it can be called on to run at the same exact time. So we can open threads to be batching all of getting these customers for each list of invoices at the same time instead of going one by one by one. So that's what we're going to look at doing in our next step. Does anybody have any questions so far in the actual paginating of the data from Stripe?
I guess I have one question that's just, okay, about the concept of pagination. So paginating just basically means that we're establishing the batch for, we're establishing this group that's getting tackled in this one lump sum. Is that what that means technically?
Kind of, yes. So think of it as like, if you have, say you have 20,000 records, each of those records are going to be kind of grouped together in a smaller subsection that you can grab from, and you need to go and grab every batch of those records. So that's called paginating. Like the process of going to grab those records in those batches is called paginating. So example of looking at this is like when you Google something. So if you Google cats, there's thousands of pages on cats, right? Or hundreds of thousands, millions of pages. And what Google does at the very bottom is it shows only a certain amount of pages or a certain amount of results per page. right? So you have like maybe 10 results on the first page, and then you click to go to the next page, click to go to the next page, click to go to the next page. It's the same process here. We're clicking to go to the next page. We're requesting the next batch of data, the next page of data.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So this guy's still running, still getting our customers. We're going to let it run for a while, then we'll stop it because who knows how long this is. We'll keep going. There's a lot of data. A lot of this data is put in by other customers. There's endpoints that allow people to upload stuff. So this could go on forever, but this shows you that this process makes it scalable. You could start as a small business and only have 100 records, but you want to, and that first workflow that we built works fine. But we want to think of our workflows in the sense that we want them to grow with us, and we don't want to have to make these major updates to them later on. So think of it, when you're building, you want to build it to last, and you want to build it to scale with you and how much data can be brought into the workflow. And that's why we went ahead and updated the first iteration, the first solution that we had that just went and fetched one batch of data, to then continue batching. Even if there was 100, this would only need to batch or fetch one request and stop, but it's set up to continue and continue and continue until we've gotten everything. So now we're going to optimize it for some speed, and so that it makes it a little bit easier to maintain. I imagine for each invoice, we're only doing one step, but that's not always the case. There's probably going to be additional steps going on within this loop here. So this process could take an additional amount of time, slowing down our overall process. So how we can speed this up and just make it easier to maintain is separating it out. How I'll do that is going back to my dashboard. I'm going to find my workflow that I just built. I'm going to click on the 3-dot indicator, and I'm going to click duplicate. After I click on duplicate, I'm going to remove copy of. And at the end, I'm just going to make sure that I know that this is the callable. So you can put callable here. So I'll put callable, and I'm going to click duplicate. So now I have my duplicate copy. Anytime you make a duplicate, even if it is organization level, whenever you duplicate it, it's going to make it a personal level workflow. So if you duplicate it and you're in your organization workspace and you're like, where did it go? Go back to your personal to check if it's there. Moving into my cloned workflow that has callable at the end, I see it's exactly the same that I have in my other workflow, but I don't need all these steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove everything except for my step right here, my batching step, or not my batching, but my for each step. So I can grab my for each and drag it down, which let me scale out. I'm going to put it underneath my loop step, so it's outside of my loop 2. It's just my for each and my get customers. And I'm going to delete all of this. So now I just have my for each invoice and my get customer. The last thing I need to do here for updates, on the trigger, I'm going to click on the 3-dot indicator after hovering over. I'm going to click replace, and I'm going to use my callable trigger. So this allows you to break down your workflows into bite-sized pieces and allows you to open up threads from other workflows to run processes in parallel. So now I need to change my list helper from pointing to Stripe data 1 or Stripe 1 data to my trigger, because it's going to be passed to this workflow from my previous workflow. So what I'll do is just update my connector snake pointing to my trigger. I'm going to select data, and I'm going to say dot invoices. This doesn't exist yet, but we're going to add it momentarily. So I have my invoices pointing here. I don't need to make any more changes because this doesn't point to anything outside of the loop. It's isolated to this loop. The only update I needed to make was to the loop itself. Now what I can do, I actually don't even need to enable it. It's already enabled. I just need to go back to my previous workflow to pass the data into this workflow and remove these steps from that original workflow since it's being taken care of here. So go back to my dashboard, back into my workflow without the callable in the name. Scroll down to your loop 1 and stripe 2. You can delete this step. We already have it in our other workflow. It's gone. What we want to do is replace it with a callable connector. So what I'm going to do is search for callable in my connector pane, drag it onto my workflow. It's showing me the indicator telling me that there's additional configurations required for this step. I'll click into it. This is going to be a fire and forget. I don't need it to reply to me. They're just going to be off doing their own thing. Next, what I want to do is select the workflow. So I'm going to click on the Stripe workflow that I just created. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the data. So remember.
Hey, Amber,
Yep.
I'm not getting, when I'm refreshing the workflow list and I'm not getting that one available.
Okay, so
Might be kept in personal.
I'll go check.
sometimes I have that issue as well. So like you just saw, mine wasn't showing up as a different name. So what you can do is go to your workflow. If you ever encounter that issue, let us know. But to get around it, what you can do is grab the ID from the URL of your child workflow. And once you have that ID in your parent workflow, you can paste the value and say set to. So that's an alternate solution into to work out the issue if you don't see your workflow showing up in your dropdown.
Okay, that seems to have worked. They were both in the personal workspace, so that was
Yeah, I'm
probably
not
just
sure
what I
why that's
needed.
happening. We'll definitely take a look at that for you. So the next thing that you want to do is just make sure that you have your invoices being passed into that workflow. So I'm going to create a key called invoices. And the value is going to be like it was pointing to the list, but now it's pointing to my callable, my output from Stripe 1, which is data. So data has a key of invoices. I added one property and I made the value the output from Stripe 1. Last thing I'm going to do here is update the title to process invoices. Does everybody have that? So we're using fire and forget. We're adding invoices. We're passing in the data. Now let's go back to our child workflow. You can either just go from here or you can select it from your dropdown. I have quite a few, so I find it easier to come back to my dashboard. I'm going to go to my child workflow. And there's one thing I wanted to update here was the title. And we also need to change the operation. This is new, so I'm still remembering I need to do this. We now allow callable workflows to respond back to parent workflows. So whatever the option you selected, fire and forget, it needs to reflect what's in your child. So I'm just going to make sure that this is just the trigger. I'm not going to respond. Does everybody have the values that I have? Any questions before we run the workflow? Awesome. So navigating back to the parent workflow, we can now run the steps. So I'm going to stop the process here. It's been running for 14 minutes. It's been going for a while. We can actually see what element we're on. So these are the children. So I think this is, yep, here. I don't even know how many records we've gotten so far. We can take a look at that in a minute, but I'm going to stop this by hovering. What I did was hovered over the running workflow or the running execution that was yellow, and there was a stop button, and I just clicked on it. And now you can see it says stopped. There's no need for me to run this process anymore. This is just demonstrating that this is continuously fetching data. And we can see, if you scroll through, you can see that data was returned. It went down my true branch, fetched my last item, set the cursor, and then went around again, grabbed the cursor. You can see there's my cursor, passed the cursor in, and I got a new batch of data to then process. So I've been running for, it was running for 14 minutes, and it was on loop 16. So it's taking quite a bit of time to grab that many records. So we want to speed that up. And that's why we're going to pass in the additional Stripe calls to a callable workflow. So let's try to make sure that the data is being passed in by clicking Run Workflow. Move to your debug logs. We can see that this trigger was called on. So how you can navigate to the child is in your builder. If you click on the callable trigger and you right click it, you can say open callable workflow. This will open your workflow. You can move to your debug logs, and you can see I've obviously made a mistake and it's not finding a key. So let's see what's being passed in. The key was invoices. I can come here. Looks like it is invoices. Not sure why it's not finding it. Why? Let's see. Trigger data. Let's do it in. Let me see. So you can see all of our children are coming in, but they're going to continue to fail. So I'm going to come back here and stop this until I can change this. I can rerun it to see why this failed, or if it fails again with the change that I made. So you can see now that's working. So what happened was I blindly went like this and copied it and just put data where the trigger, I know from looking at this, is actually just trigger. There's no dot data. And that's why we want to make sure to use output. Sometimes making the guess, you can make mistakes like this. Not a big deal. I stopped it so those executions aren't running or more data is not being passed in, but I have my trigger and I can put dot and you can see what I have available. I want all of the invoices, so I'll just do that. And now if I were to rerun this from my parent, those should run successfully into the child. Come back and we can see we're getting data passed in from the child or the parent workflow into the child workflow. And each of these are being processed at the same time. And that's our use case. Any questions?
Amber, I'm not seeing a way to. I guess the only way to stop the loop on the child trigger is to stop it up on the parent trigger. Is that correct?
Yep. So data will continue to be called into the child if the parent's still going. So here you can see I can click stop on this parent, and obviously the ones that are still running will continue to run. But if something fails, like you can see here, this is failing, which we're going to talk about why it's failing. So we can either stop each execution, or we can let it just finish or fail, whatever's happening, but no more data is going to be passed in. So now, if you guys still have time, if not, this recording will be sent to you, and we also have the slides that are available. I just want to talk about limitations. So limitations within your workflow when doing processes like this. So there's different limitations you have to take into consideration when you're building out your workflow, how often a workflow can run, how long a service takes to respond, and then API rate limits, and then the size limitation. So you can see we had all these steps running at the same time, and some of these steps started failing, right? Some of these steps, whoops, looks like they're going now, but some of the steps I saw, I was getting a rate limit. The reason that being is that every API, not every API, but most APIs are going to have some limitation on how many calls can be made per amount of time. So for the instance of Stripe, you're only allowed to make 20 read calls per second. So that means I can have 20 calls happening, and right now I have every 3 seconds, because this takes about or a little over 3 seconds because of all these steps as well. It takes 3 seconds to respond. How many seconds is going to take to go through this logic and then loop around? So these calls are fine. There's enough time in between each call, about 3 seconds. It's not going to hit that 20 calls per second. But when you're parallelizing things out, all of these calls are happening at the same time. All of these threads are calling the same API at the same exact time. And so you can get issues where you're going to get rate limited. This happens a lot with, say, Salesforce. Salesforce is really strict on how many calls can be paid, not maybe by the second, but by the day or by the hour. So when you're planning out trying to make your workflow scalable and run faster, you still have to take into consideration the limits of particular APIs. If it's by the second, you might put a delay after every time you call. Maybe you put like 1 second delay between calling a new workflow, and that would alleviate the issue of having too many calls at once. For longer delays, you can use the delay step of like more than a second. Maybe you can put it up to 10 minutes. If you need it longer than 10 minutes, there's a process to create a loop that continues to loop until a certain amount of time has passed. So say if you have already met your rate limit for an hour and you need to wait an hour before you can make more calls, then you have to put this delay in there. All of this needs to be taken into consideration when you're building out the workflow, and especially when you're building it out in a parallelized way, so that you're not hitting these rate limits and your workflow isn't failing. But when you do stuff like this, you do have the option to use some of the skills that we learned in previous steps or previous sessions, like error handling, retries, and then also within that retry, you can put a wait. As for the limitations with your how long or how often a workflow can run, so a process like this where it's pulling every single record, I don't want to overrun the API and call it every minute or every even maybe 10 minutes, because we can see that this is still running. It took we don't know how long it will take. We need to benchmark how long does a normal process take to complete in order to say, I can run this workflow X amount of time. Not saying the workflow is not capable of running that often, it's the limitation of the service, because we don't want to get rate limited where they ban you from making more API calls. They do this to protect themselves and all the rest of their customers. Other limitations that we looked at were size limitations. So some of the size limitations that there are how big your payload is. So inside of here, when we call on these invoices, all this data, all of these rows, every character is going to have a size to it, right? So each connector, like our data storage or script connector, can only consume so much data at once. So if you're running to a problem where the connector is not able to process as much data as you have, so maybe you have a CSV or you're pulling in 20,000 emails from outreach, or a huge amount of data, and you're trying to push it all into a single step, you might need to use a chunking operation that will be able to batch this into smaller steps. So what you could do here before calling on this callable workflow is use another list helper. And what the list helper has an option to do is to chunk. So there's this chunk operation that allows you to take a list. So say we say the list from here, and this is going to say, right now it's 100, but if this was like much larger data coming back, if maybe Stripe's limit wasn't 100, maybe it was 10,000 at a time, I might want to chunk this into smaller batches of, say 50. So I'll have more threads open, but then I have to take into consideration, those threads are going to be running in parallel. I might increase my delay in between calls, but now I have a list of smaller sub batches. And what I'll have to do is add another loop step. And as you add loops, you're going to add complexity for time. So you could even put this into its own call, this portion into another callable workflow that calls on this child. Definitely gets a little more advanced there. But here we have our list of lists. So this will contain a list of smaller batches, and I can loop over the smaller batches. And for each batch, I can then change my invoices to come from here. So what this is doing is taking my group of 100, breaking that into 2 groups of 50, and now I have, instead of one thread of 100, I have 2 groups of 50, 2 threads of 50 running at the same time. So that's one way to speed up your workflows even faster, because maybe having those 50 done at the same time versus waiting for 100 to complete is something that you're needing. Maybe it's not 50. Obviously, we're looking at this in smaller numbers, but this is how you could create more threads to speed up your workflow. Any questions on how to create batches or limitations that you could run into while creating your paginating of data? Awesome. Well, I hope that everybody learned something today, and I'd love to see some examples if you guys decide to use any of the concepts that we covered in your own use cases.